Hello and good evening, friends, colleagues, distinguished industry leaders, and thank you Economic Times for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this stage. Let me start first on the supply chain, and then we'll come on to the Q-commerce, and then we'll see how the both supply chain and Q-commerce go together, and how can you build a successful supply chain in Q-commerce kind of a business model. My journey with supply chain started around a decade and a half back, 15 years back. And as one of the speakers was mentioning that most of us are not formally trained in supply chain, but we are put into supply chain. That's what happened with me. But fortunately, I landed up into one of the workshops of supply chain, and we were made to play a game, the famous Roots Beer game, right? And I'm sure a lot of you would have played that game. And then it was followed by a group discussion, an hour-long group discussion on, what are your key takeaways from this Roots Beer game. And the takeaways stuck with me for last 15 years, which I have been implementing across the organizations where I worked. And there were 3 in number, right? The first one was, those who have the ability to forecast better and forecast closer to your consumption will have an advantage over any other player in the market, right? That was the first principle out of that. The second principle was that those who have the shorter lead times, those who are crazy about lead times will always have an advantage over their competition. And the third principle was, those who are agile in their supply chain, those who can change their model quickly, those who can respond faster to change in the demand or change in the supply will have an advantage over their competition. And these are exactly 3 principles which stuck with me for a long, long time. And Zepto is, in a way, outcome of these 3 principles of the supply chain. In this, of course, there are many other, you need to have right talent in place, you need to have, right technology in place, you need to have right models in place, et cetera, et cetera. But everything revolves around these 3 principles, right? Let me talk about each of these principles in a little more detail. The first principle, the ability to forecast, and Q-commerce is all about forecasting, right? Quick commerce has 2 aspects to it, like any other business. One is the demand side of it, second is the supply side of it, right? Demand is heavily scattered, right? Q-commerce, as all of you know, has got hundreds of delivery hubs across cities, and you need to forecast for every delivery hub hour by hour. That in every hour, how much demand you're going to get. Why hourly demand is important? Because your supply has to be hourly. Your last mile supply has to be built at an hourly level, not at a day level. If you build at a day level, there will be heavy underutilization in place, right? So that's the first part of forecasting, which is the demand forecasting at an hourly level at a store SKU combination, right? The second aspect of demand forecasting is that how much inventory you need to place in the store, right? And this replenishment happens every day because the contribution of fresh categories in a Q-commerce is extremely high. It's as high as 40%. The perishables, which has a shelf life of less than 2 days. And therefore, if the forecasting goes for a toss, it will result into huge amount of waste, right? And it will straight away hit into the bottom line. So therefore, forecasting is an extremely, extremely important step in the Q-commerce supply chain, and forecasting is an ever-evolving model, right? What we did in forecasting was that we started with a very basic model of exponential smoothing, and we kept on building those models. The beauty of supply chain is that supply chain is one of the subjects which is very, very close to theory. What happens in theory is what exactly happens in the real life if you are able to mathematically model it. And that's where we invested significantly in our early days, and even today, on the supply chain models. We keep building on the forecasting models. And what we realized was that every product has a different forecasting model. There is no no one model for every single product. Every single product will have a different forecasting model in place. Similarly, every store will have a different forecasting model in place, right? And that's what actually worked for us. And as a result, today we operate at one of the, at a globally one of the best wastages levels, right? Despite having availability of over 90% of the products always in stock. So the second problem statement is the availability here. And one of the speakers was mentioning that, out of stock is unpardonable in this supply chain, right? Once you lose demand, you lose it forever. More than that, you lose the customer forever, right? The customer is going to shift. And that's the reason the availability of the product also becomes important. And therefore, again, this forecasting model comes into play. The second element of supply chain, as I talked about, is the lead time. Your ability to replenish faster. And why lead times are important? Because in a retail business, specifically in a grocery retail business, which are thin margin businesses, you cannot afford to have an inventory which is more than your days of credit on hand. What does that mean? That your working capital has to be negative all the time. Because every time you grow, if your working capital is positive, you need to infuse money to grow, which is not sustainable, despite being profitable, right? And therefore, your days of inventory on hand has to be lesser than the days of credit you have from your suppliers, right? To do that, the only way is that your lead times has to be faster. Your ability to replenish has to be faster, and your frequency of ordering has to be higher, right? So these are the three principles on which we built our replenishment model, that we will order as soon as the MOV and MOQs are formed. We will not wait for the traditional ordering frequency. Second is, as soon as we get the stocks in our DCs, we will look at the opportunity of cross-dock, move it to our stores directly. And the third is that how do we work with our supply partners in reducing their lead times to supply it to us. And the last one is that your ability to replenish multiple times in a day in the store. Although there is a cost-benefit equation around it, that if you replenish multiple times in a day, there is also a cost associated with it, because you have to have one more run of vehicle, and you also need people to do second replenishment in the stores. And the utilization of both comes into play. But yeah, at a very high throughput stores, it starts making sense, right? Where your rent starts balancing off the cost of multiple replenishments. So that's on the inventory side of it. The third side of it is the last mile, which is extremely, extremely complex in a Q-commerce business. So as I told, the forecasting has to be an hourly level, and the last mile supply also has to be built at an hourly level, right? Because in last mile, what is important is the two parameters. One is what is the EPH, the earning per hour of the last mile delivery partner, EPH, and second is the OPH, the number of orders per hour you can do per delivery partner, right? As long as your OPH is high, and if you operate at a market EPH, your cost per order will be low, right? If your OPH starts going down, you need to pay the same amount, your cost per order starts going up, right? To have a sustainable supply chain, it's important that the earning of the delivery partner should not drop, but your orders per delivery partner should start gradually increasing, right? And that is a very simple metric called underutilization for that, or utilization for that, either ways. And the idea is, how do you maximize utilization without compromising with the increase in your delivery times, right? And that's where the whole supply planning comes into play. That once you forecasted your demand, how do you plan your supply? The constraints are that what are the kind of shifts you are planning? What are the modes of transport you are planning? Because we do deliveries on bicycles, we do deliveries on electric cycles, we do deliveries on electric bikes, we do delivery on petrol bikes, right? And each of these vehicles have a different lead time. The Google ETA only works for the petrol bikes. The rest other vehicles have a different lead times. And so how do you plan? And then we have full-timers, we also have part-timers in play. So how do you plan your shifts? And we run 7 shifts during the day, 7 staggered shifts during the day. So whole supply planning model built around it, gives us a utilization which is one of the highest in the country today. We operate at a OPH which is roughly 70% higher than the nearest competition. And this is essentially a result of investing into the supply planning models around it. Coming on to the sustainability part of it, as I told, we have got bicycles because our delivery radiuses are very small. We deliver in, our average delivery radius is 1.5 kilometers. So all the orders which are less than 800, 900 meters gets delivered on bicycles. Today we do around 20% deliveries on bicycles. Then we have electric bicycles, which are electrically assisted bicycles. Another 15% deliveries happens on electric bicycles, right? Another 15% happens through part-timers, who already have a work somewhere and they're free for 4 hours in the morning, 4 hours in the evening. This not only, because what happens in the electric cycles and electric bicycles, your cost of ownership of asset is very, very low, and there is no cost of petrol associated with it. And therefore, your last mile cost starts going down, but the earning of the delivery partner starts going up. And that has worked very, very beautifully for us in the last mile planning. The last aspect of the Q-commerce on supply chain side is your ability to plan the better network, or the stores. Where do you want to put your delivery hubs? And this is a slightly complicated subject because of a lot of absence of data, but there are sources of data where you can actually map over 1,000 parameters, and that's what we did actually. We were able to get hold of that data. We were able to, and this data is in the form of how many households are there, what's the average household income of an area, how many schools are there, how many hospitals are there, how many Domino's outlets are there, how many Pizza Hut outlets are there, how many medical stores are there in a particular given area. And there are sources which open in the public forum where you can get that data, and then we have run the regression around it, that which parameters out of these are the most impactful ones or has the highest coefficients, and we shortlisted around 10 parameters, and we built an algorithm around it that today, if I want to plan a store in a geography which none of us has ever visited, you can still pinpoint that this is the location where you should have the store. And then we draw an area that this is the exact store I want, and this is where the acceptable limit of the store is. And beyond this, if you go, a certain percentage of your customers will not get deliveries in, will not get consistent deliveries in 10 minutes, right? That delivery will start going off the shoot. And if it starts going beyond 10 minutes, my cost starts going up. The simple reason, like if you can deliver in 10 minutes, with plain maths, you can do 3 deliveries per hour per rider, right? If your delivery times goes from 10 to 20 minutes, you can do 2.5 deliveries. Sorry, not 1.5 delivery per hour. And that's the reason 10 minutes is extremely, extremely important for us. That the shorter the radius is, the faster is the delivery, better is the experience, lower is the cost, counterintuitively, right? And that is something which is the basic principle behind building the Q-commerce. How are we looking Q-commerce at Zepto? We started with grocery. As I told you, 40% of our penetration is for perishables, fruits, vegetables, dairy, bakery, etc. And remaining 60% is the core FMCG, CPG penetration. Now, what we have seen is that we tried with some new categories. We introduced general merchandise, right? It's a high lead time category. Your procurement times are higher. But we saw that there is a sudden spike in the demand the moment we launched that category, right? Then we tested waters with beauty as a category, and we saw a certain spike in demand in the beauty and stabilized at a certain level. So what we are noticing is that the desire to get the deliveries faster is increasing over a period of time. The customers who are used to now get groceries in 10 minutes are also wanting to have other categories also in 10 minutes, right? While the limitation is that your size of the delivery hubs, how much can you stock there, and therefore, what's the Pareto of every category that needs to be stocked. We started our stores with 2,500 unique articles stock. Today, through various design interventions, we've been able to bring it up to 7,000 unique SKUs per store in a space of around 3,000 square feet in place. And the end result of it is that the throughput of the stores, because of the expansion in the assortment, improvement in the availability, and the 10 minutes grocery delivery magic, has been such that the revenue per square feet has gone as high as 1 lakh rupees per square feet per year, right? That's I would say is one of the best in class. There are very few organizations who operate at that kind of a revenue per square feet. Last but not the least, it is essentially largely supply chain, which also enables the organization to price your products lower, right? Or to price your products appropriately. The reason is that the efficiency you have in the supply chain, the lower the cost of your supply chain, the better the design of the supply chain. It gives you immense ability to actually operate at a much lesser price point also for the customers, right? And that is something which is essentially the principle behind the pricing which we do. That what's my cost to service that order? What's my cost to procure a particular SKU and service the SKU to the customers? So essentially, just to summarize my thoughts around it, we have invested heavily into forecasting models, the mathematics behind forecasting, and tried to productize it in the form of technology. The second is that we've worked insanely and heavily on reducing the lead times into everything that we do, whether it's procurement, whether it's ordering, whether it's replenishment, whether it's servicing to the customer. And the third is that we have built a supply chain in a very agile way, that if you have to introduce a new category, how soon can you turn it around? If you have to introduce a new product line, how soon can you turn it around, right? If you have to operate with 2 different DCs in a city, how soon can you figure out the right model and start second DC? If you have to scale a particular DC, what's the kind of fungibility you have in a DC? Rather than operating at a 50% utilization, can we operate at 90% utilization and scale faster and get a second DC in place? So this is the thought process at which we continuously kept working on. And our entire hiring also has revolved around these 3 principles, right? So we've hired talent who can actually stand by these principles and keep delivering on these principles, because this has resulted in a structural advantage over a competition. And what we have realized is that it's the discipline of the design and the discipline of the principles which gives you advantage over hustlers. And today I can proudly say that we are one of the pioneers of Q-commerce in India. We are one of the fastest growing Q-commerce in the country and in the world. And we've been able to build a supply chain which is not just agile and sophisticated, but it's also one of the lowest cost supply chain in the world. And that's one of the reason why the whole confidence level on the Q-commerce has gone up with time, not just in the investors community, but also in the customers domain. And the industry has grown from literally 0 to today over $3 billion of top line, and it's growing over 100% year on year. And I'm sure there was a study which says that it will grow up to $50 billion in next 5 years, which itself is a significant scale. And if you look at vis-a-vis traditional e-commerce, it would be almost comparable to the traditional e-commerce today in India. With that thought, thank you so much for listening to me, and I'll end here.